Every year, the world loses legends. But some years hit differently. Some years take names that carry decades of history with them. Names that belong not just to record books and medal tables, but to the memories of millions of people who watched them compete and felt something that sport rarely produces twice. 2025 and 2026 were those years. One after another, the Olympic world said goodbye to champions who had defined eras, broken records, and changed what their sports looked like forever. This is their story. George Foreman. March 21st, 2025. Age 76 before the grill, before the comeback. Before the second heavyweight championship at 45 that made the entire world stop and reconsider what age meant for a professional athlete. Before any of that, there was Mexico City, 1968. A 19-year-old from Marshall, Texas, walked into the Olympic boxing tournament with a power that the sport had rarely seen at that age and proceeded to dismantle every opponent placed in front of him with a controlled aggression that felt less like boxing and more like a force of nature expressing itself through two fists. George Foreman won the Olympic heavyweight gold medal in 1968 and waved a small American flag in the ring afterward in a moment that became one of the most iconic images in Olympic history. It was an act of pride from a young man who had grown up in poverty so severe that food was not always guaranteed, who had been involved in street crime as a teenager before a Job Corps program redirected his life toward boxing, and who had arrived in Mexico City as an unknown and left as a champion. What followed that gold medal was one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of combat sports. Two separate heavyweight championship reigns, a knockout loss to Muhammad Ali in Zaire in 1974 that entered mythology, a 10-year retirement followed by a comeback that the sport mocked until it could not mock anymore, and then, in 1994, at the age of 45, a knockout victory over Michael Moorer that returned the heavyweight championship to a man the world had already written off twice. He died on March 21, 2025, at the age of 76. The cause was cardiac arrest. He had spent his final decades as a minister, a father of 10 children, and the face of a kitchen appliance that sold over 100 million units worldwide. None of that erased what he had been in that ring in Mexico City. A 19-year-old with a small flag and a gold medal and a future that even he could not have fully imagined. Agnes Keleti. January 2nd, 2025. Age 103. The oldest Olympic champion in history. That was the title she carried into her final years, and it was accurate in the most extraordinary sense possible. Agnes Keleti did not just live longer than any other Olympic gold medalist in history. She lived a life that contained more survival, more loss, and more comeback than most stories are permitted to hold. She was born in Budapest in 1921 into a Jewish family in a Hungary that would spend the following decades becoming one of the most dangerous places in Europe for Jewish people to exist. The 1944 deportations took her father to Auschwitz, where he was killed. Keleti survived by obtaining false papers and working as a maid, hiding her identity while the world she had known was being systematically destroyed around her. After the war, she returned to gymnastics. At the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, she won her first gold medal at the age of 31, an age at which most gymnasts had already been retired for years. At the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, she won 4 more gold medals at 35, becoming the oldest individual gymnastics champion in Olympic history. Then, as the Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest in November 1956, she made the decision not to return home. She defected to Israel, where she would build the rest of her life and eventually become the head of the Israeli Olympic Committee's sports school. She died on January 2025, 2 weeks before what would have been her 104th birthday. The gymnastics world lost its oldest living champion. The world lost something harder to name, the proof that survival and excellence could occupy the same life completely. Dick Button, January 30th, 2025. Age 95, 2 Olympic gold medals, 5 consecutive world championships, and a list of technical achievements in figure skating that reads less like a competitive record and more like a series of impossibilities that one person decided to resolve. Dick Button won his first Olympic gold medal at the 1948 St. Moritz Games at the age of 18, becoming the first American man to win the Olympic figure skating title. He defended it at the 1952 Oslo Games. In between and around those victories, he invented moves that the sport had never seen, landed jumps that coaches had told him were not possible, and pushed the technical ceiling of his discipline so far beyond where it had been that the sport spent decades catching up to what he had done. He died on January 30th, 2025, at the age of 95. After his competitive career ended, he became the voice of figure skating for American audiences, a television commentator whose knowledge and occasionally sharp opinions defined how generations of viewers understood the sport. His contribution to skating was not just what he did on the ice. It was the standard he set for what the ice could ask of a human body and what a human body could answer. Laura Dahlmeier, July 28, 2025. Age 31. The one that took the breath away, not because it was unexpected in the way that illness takes people, because it was 31 years old, because it was a rock slide in the Karakoram Mountains of Pakistan, at an altitude of 5,700 metres, because Laura Dahlmeier had already given the world everything her sport had to offer, and had then walked away from it at 25, at the absolute peak of her ability to pursue the mountains that had always been her second love. At the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, Dahlmeier won 2 gold medals in biathlon. She was 24 years old. She had already won the overall World Cup title the previous season, with 5 individual gold medals, a performance that had no precedent in the modern history of the sport. She was, by any honest measure, the best biathlete in the world at the time she competed. And then she retired. Not from injury, not from burnout in the conventional sense. She retired because she had done what she came to do, and because the mountains were calling in a direction the competition circuit could not provide. She was killed on July 28, 2025, when a rock slide struck her climbing team at high altitude in Pakistan. She was 31 years old. The biathlon world lost its greatest modern champion. The mountains that she had loved as much as any race took her in a way that no one who had watched her compete could have anticipated or accepted easily. Hulk Hogan, July 24, 2025. Age 71. He was not an Olympic athlete in the traditional sense, but his connection to the Olympic world ran deeper than most people remembered by the end of his career. Terry Bollea, who the world knew as Hulk Hogan, had been a serious amateur weightlifter and wrestler before professional wrestling absorbed his life entirely. He competed at events that sat on the edges of what the Olympic movement recognised, in an era when the line between performance and competition was drawn differently than it is today. What he became was something the Olympic world could not have manufactured. The most recognisable professional wrestler in history, a figure whose influence on the relationship between sport and entertainment, between competition and spectacle, between athletics and popular culture, shaped the landscape that every major sporting property navigated for the next 4 decades. He died on July 24, 2025, at the age of 71 from cardiac arrest. The body that had performed under the most extreme physical conditions for 30 years had finally reached its limit. What remained was a name that meant something specific to every person who had watched him in their childhood, and understood even then that what they were seeing was not just a performance. It was a kind of athletic commitment that the word entertainment never fully captured. Fred Newhouse, 2025. His name does not appear in the conversations that most people have about Olympic sprinting. It should. Fred Newhouse ran the 400 meters for the United States at the 1976 Montreal Olympics and won a silver medal in the individual event before anchoring the American relay team to the gold. He was one of the fastest quarter-milers of his generation, competing in an era when the 400 meters was producing some of the deepest fields in the history of the event, when the difference between gold and silver and fifth place could be measured in fractions that required technology to separate. He died in 2025, largely without the recognition that the result alone would have produced for an athlete of a later era. When social media and the attention economy ensure that Olympic silver medalists are known by name for years after their careers end. Newhouse competed and won and returned to a life outside the spotlight, with the quiet dignity of a generation of athletes who understood that the medal was the thing, not what followed it. The Olympic movement is built on records and results, on times and distances and margins that separate one performance from another and assign them to history in the order they were produced. But the athletes who carried those records were more than the numbers attached to their names. They were people who had survived things the records do not measure, who had built careers under conditions the highlights do not show, who had given something to their sports that outlasted every medal and every world record and every standing ovation. George Foreman waved a small flag in Mexico City in 1968 and became a legend before he understood what legendary meant. Agnes Keleti survived a war that tried to erase her and then went to the Olympics and won gold medals at 35. Dick Button landed jumps that the sport said were impossible and then spent 50 years explaining to television audiences why the impossible mattered. Laura Dahlmeier won 2 Olympic golds at 24 and walked away because she loved the mountains more than the podium, and the mountains took her at 31. Fred Newhouse ran one of the fastest 400 meters in Olympic history and returned to his life without needing the world to know his name. They are gone now. The records remain, the names remain, and the understanding of what it costs to stand on an Olympic starting line and give everything you have remains for everyone who watched them do it. Rest well.